The Global Thematic Consultation on Governance and Post-2015 Development Agenda is currently underway at the Pan-African Parliament. Joining us now in studio to unpack some of the key issues on governance and accountability is Brian Kagoro. He is the Policy Advisor for Governance at the United Nations. Brian, thank you so much for joining us. A lot of people are wondering, what is Agenda 2015? We all were talking about the Millennium Development Goals. We now have a new platform. In one way, is this just kind of a seamless transition from one to the other? Or are we going to reflect on whether the Millennium Development Goals has in fact been achieved?
The Millennium Development Goals, when first formulated, was largely done by consultants and the heads of state, and set goals based on the eradication of extreme poverty. We are less than 2,000 days to 2015, which is the target date for the Millennium Development Goals.
Yes. Some
progress has been made. So there will be review, and there has been ongoing review of progress made. But there is also a need from experience over the last 15 years. We've seen that owing to the structure of the global economy, developments within the global economy, the recession, the financial crisis, the food crisis, the fuel crisis, the energy crisis, that it is imperative that the global development agenda not only target poor countries, number one. Number two, that it is truly global in the sense that it sets targets and benchmarks and indicators both at the local, national, regional and global level. Recognizes differences within and amongst countries, but at the same time has a framework which allows policy space at the country level, but also is transformational in its nature. So what we're looking at is structural transformation and not just dealing with poverty. We've made some progress in education, HIV/AIDS infection, maternal health and mortality, but structurally, inequality has increased.
In fact, that's the point I wanted to come to, and I want to bring it to an African context. I mean, it's one thing to deal with poverty, but if one is to beat back poverty in a fundamental way and change the ability of the poor to actually lift themselves out of penury, one has to look at inequality. To what extent is the Agenda 2015 going to be focusing on dealing with inequality and not just poverty? Is it going to be a much more radical approach to the kind of changes that are required in societies?
The conversation currently going on, and there have been many, 9 thematic consultation, over 50 country level consultations, regional consultation of youth, of women, of indigenous peoples, is premised on one understanding, that what you require is a global development agenda that is transformational, ecologically so, politically so, socially so, and economically so. And because it is transformational, you have to ask what has been wrong with the current paradigm, or what's limiting with the current paradigm. Whilst it's important to reduce extreme poverty, it's also very important to create conditions for self-employment and other forms of employment, for inclusive economic growth, and for the eradication of inequality. And if you're to do that, you have to address fundamentals. What are those fundamentals? Global governance is one of those fundamentals. There is inequity in the terms and trade arrangements. There is inequity in the way we deal with natural resource governance, for example. There is inequity in the way we deal with the governance of broader ecological factors.
But Brian, I mean, the things that you're outlining is without any kind of disrespect, it's fairly obvious. We all agree on that. Of course, the difficulty is to get people to commit to common programs, and to get particularly the stronger and more developed countries to actually implement. And of course, the UN is always trying to bring people together, trying to consult. But there's a big difference between consulting and implementation. What has been the evaluation from your side in terms of the Millennium Development Goals around getting people to commit to implementation? I had someone from the UN on very recently on Beyond Markets talking about maternal mortality on the African continent, and the refusal of several African countries to in fact commit to targets. Women on the African continent are still dying whilst giving birth to children, something that ought not to be happening given the kinds of growth that we see on the continent, for example. So talk about implementation, and more importantly, how you're going to get people to commit.
I think that that is precisely why we're having this consultation. The previous regime of targets were set up there. There was no demand side because the people hadn't been part of determining what the targets would be, how they would be monitored and implemented. The oversight institutions, whether it's parliaments, courts, and other at the local level, had not been involved. What's different with this process is that it's a bottom-up approach, and the implementation is not only at the global level, it's implementation at the local level, at the national, at the regional, and at the global. And the targets are not an imposition. There's not even an agreement that it will necessarily be targets. The agreement is on the nature of the development framework, on the thinking about development cooperation. I think that we're talking beyond a narrative that looks at ODA and external sources. In the discussions over the last 4 days, we're talking about how Africa can raise domestic resources and regional resources to deal with our own development without being dependent on external resources that limit Africa's policy space.